On July the 26th, Egypt's charismatic new leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, seized control of the Suez Canal. The British Prime Minister, Sir Anthony Eden, was determined to get it back, as his wife recalls.
There was nothing but Suez, 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 morning, noon and night in number 10.
This is the story of how Eden conspired with France and Israel to wage war against Nasser.
I have a plan of action, Sir Anthony, for Britain and France to...
Of a secret conference near Paris.
But the trip to Paris was to be entirely secret. Nothing was to be known about this whole arrangement.
Of a bizarre trip to a cabaret to ease conference stress.
We were young guys. We wanted to see a famous French nightclub.
A conspiracy that caused British diplomats to flounder.
We were left maintaining a story which no one believed.
A conspiracy that surprised Nasser, at least in part.
We were thinking about French collusion with Israel. We were keeping completely out of mind the British collusion.
The August bank holiday was one of the few hot days that summer. But while many were soaking up the sunshine, the British bulldog was becoming dimly aware of an impending call to arms. Shortly after the bank holiday, Sir Anthony Eden arrived with his wife at the BBC to explain his tough line on the Suez crisis. It was producer Alistair Milne's job to supervise the broadcast.
It was very hot, a very hot, humid August day, and we had a problem because short of studios, we had to take him to the presentation studio, which was a tiny little box, very narrow, very cramped. Oh, it's awful, really.
For Britain, the Suez Canal has always been the main artery to the Commonwealth.
He was a great state. He was very nervous. He was very nervous.
I just can't see these damn words. Through it travels today about half the oil, which the industry of this country. Look, can something be done about these damn lights?
Perhaps, sir, might I suggest, if you tried it again with the spectacles this time?
I will not be seen on television with spectacles.
Vanity, fundamentally, that he felt that if he put his glasses on, he would somehow be demeaned. And I explained to him he wouldn't be able to read the script if he didn't, because the lights were hot in his eyes, you know.
Unless you'd rather learn the speech, of course. The spectacles really would...
They make me look old.
Well, he was under great strain, and I was just, trying to support him and sympathise.
Clarissa, actually, she was involved in the discussion, and she was unhappy about him wearing spectacles. He was a very good-looking man, and it obviously made him look slightly older than he wished to appear. So we spent 2 or 3 hours on the glasses, but in the end we won.
At the heart of Eden's message was his view that Nasser was a dangerous fascist dictator, a sort of Muslim Mussolini.
The Right Honourable Sir Anthony Eden, KG MC MP.
Our quarrel is not with Egypt, still less with the Arab world. It is with Colonel Nasser. He has shown that he's not a man who can be trusted to keep an agreement. The pattern is familiar to many of us, my friend. We all know this is how fascist governments behave.
Nasser was able to see clips of Eden's broadcast in the international newsreels.
I talked to President Nasser after he'd seen the clips. He said, "This is not a prime minister, a man who resorts to such a theatrical manner and gives this kind of speech."
With dictators, you always have to pay a higher price later on. For their appetite grows with feeding.
وكان رأي عبد الناصر أن إيدن رجل ضعيف.
Nasser's view was that Eden was a weak man, and a weak man always takes severe measures to prove himself.
يعني إجراءات عنيفة ليثبت.
From the start, Eden wanted the option of using force if Nasser would not climb down. At the beginning of August, 20,000 reservists were called up. Suez was not a popular destination.
What do you think of the prospect of going back there?
I think it stinks. I wouldn't like to go there at all.
I see. What do you think of that as a base?
Well, I should think it's about the worst base in the whole world to go to.
Some reservists found themselves going nowhere very fast.
In a matter of days, we had inoculations, kitted us out for desert equipment, and then they didn't know what to do with us, so we were kicking our heels in the camp.
In fact, huge amounts of men and equipment were being sent to Malta and Cyprus, the obvious jumping-off points for any possible attack on Egypt.
Once again, British troops are sailing away. We wish our boys a safe journey and a speedy return. For in the words of Sir Anthony Eden, we have too much at risk not to take precautions.
In a secret underground bunker, planners were working out how to assemble a big enough force to defeat the Egyptian army and occupy the country.
Successful. I think we can consolidate at each stage what...
There was a dual objective, one being, in the case of the Suez operation, to seize the canal, the other one being regime change.
The planners asked the Bank of England to design and make plates for an occupation currency. Eden had no problem with the idea of occupation.
I think he did believe in the imperial hand and so on.
Adam Watson was the top Egypt expert in the Foreign Office.
I think Eden had in the back of his mind that there were a great many people in the Arab world who would welcome benevolent, firm British rule, and that the occupation of Egypt would be a thing which would come to an end quite quickly, if possible, once a government had been set up which was reasonable and friendly to us.
The American president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, didn't much like Nasser either. But he didn't want one of his closest allies starting what he regarded as a colonial war, particularly when he was running for re-election. Right at the beginning of the crisis, he wrote to Eden,
Dear Anthony, early this morning I received the messages telling me on a most secret basis of your decision to employ force, without delay or attempting any intermediate and less drastic steps. I've given you my personal conviction, as well as that of my associates, as to the unwisdom even of contemplating the use of military force at this moment.
Dear friend, the removal of Nasser and the installation in Egypt of a regime less hostile to the West must rank high among our objectives. You know us better than anyone, so I need not tell you that our people here are neither excited nor eager to use force. They are, however, grimly determined that Nasser shall not get away with it this time, because they are convinced that if he does, their existence will be at his mercy. So am I.
Eden wrongly thought it was the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and not Eisenhower, who made policy.
Dulles was the one that Anthony was dealing with all the time, mostly. Dulles was the one who kept coming over and playing around, you know, initiating things and then retreating on it and all the rest of it.
Excuse me, sir, would you care to make any statement on the talks for television?
No, thank you very much.
No statement.
It was often difficult to know where Dulles stood.
His signals were very often ambivalent, yes. They implied that he would condone the use of force. they implied that he was totally with us in wanting to pull Nasser down, which in a way I think he was, but he wasn't prepared to do anything about it.
This ambivalence may have encouraged Eden to believe that he could ignore Eisenhower's warnings. The one country which was solidly behind Eden was France. It was the French who had dug the canal and, before the takeover, run it. The French Foreign Minister, Christian Pinault in particular, was enraged by Nasser's act.
La réaction de Pinault était extrêmement violente.
Pinault's reaction was violent.
Furieux.
He was furious. He gave a speech in the National Assembly in which he spoke out violently against Colonel Nasser, as he called him. I can still hear that harsh, critical voice.
Très critique, très aigu. Voilà.
Crucially, the French were angry about Nasser's interference in Algeria, then ruled by France. 500,000 troops were fighting a brutal war against a powerful independence movement. Nasser was supplying the rebels with arms. He saw himself as the leader of the Arab struggle against colonialism.
It is our responsibility to help our Arab brothers everywhere.
Over the summer, a new player secretly joined the game: Israel. The Israeli leader, David Ben-Gurion, had a house in the Negev desert, not far from the Egyptian border. In 1948, he had led his country to victory in a bitter war against the Arabs. But now Ben-Gurion was very worried about the huge number of Soviet arms Nasser was getting from communist Czechoslovakia.
The reason why we had to acquire arms, because it was after the deal between Egypt and Czechoslovakia, which sold Soviet arms in a very large number to Egypt.
The Israelis quietly turned to the French. Their approach had a peculiar resonance with the tiny, secretive group of men who controlled French foreign policy. All of them had been in the resistance against the Nazis and were very sympathetic to the Jews. Christian Pinault, the foreign minister, had been held in Buchenwald concentration camp. This picture was taken shortly after liberation.
Il était affecté à une tâche.
He was instructed to carry out the most abominable task of emptying a whole train full of Jews, 2,000 of them. 3/4 of them were already dead, and the others were dying. That was a memory that affected him profoundly.
The
day after Nasser took over the canal, a top Israeli was called in by the French Minister of Defense, Maurice Bourges-Monnery. He asked if Israel was interested in invading Egypt.
And Maurice says, were you thinking about reaching the canal? I said yes. Maurice says, what is the estimate of your army? How long will it take? I says, I think something like a couple of weeks. They exchange eyes like, I was not a serious man talking out of there. And then you intend to do it? I says, eventually, yes.
Shimon Peres said, we need a certain amount of arms, and they gave us a list. 100 tanks, 60 Mystère 4s, 50 Mystère 4Bs, saying this is the absolute minimum.
The French now began to speed up their arms deliveries. They were done in secret, as the West was supposed to be observing an arms embargo in the Middle East. French landing craft brought tanks and lorry loads of arms to a deserted beach near Haifa in the middle of the night. The Israeli Chief of Staff, Moshe Dayan, was present. So was the head of his office, who took these photos.
It was extremely exciting for us. It was like redemption.
For many months after the arms deal, the Czech arms deal, we were very worried. We don't know what will happen, because we knew that Nasser will attack us as soon as he's ready and as long as Israel doesn't have a competing force.
The American president realized that he was not getting a complete picture of what was going on.
Eisenhower was concerned that there was collusion going on between the French and the Israelis. He said, "I'll G2 my friends if I have to." Now, G2 means intelligence, that he was going to use intelligence techniques to determine what was going on. And that was the use of the U-2.
The U-2 was the first spy plane to do what is commonplace now. It could photograph amazing details from a very high altitude. France's public posture was that they were only supplying Israel with 12 Mystères because of the arms embargo. But the U-2 revealed the truth.
Prior to this time, the Israelis just had a collection of old World War II aircraft. When we overflew them on the 29th of August, we found not only 60 Mystères. Looking down, all of a sudden, the Israelis had a strike air force. And the French had told Eisenhower that they were going to sell Israel 12 aircraft, 12 Mystères. When we saw 60, Eisenhower was livid.
Over the summer, the pressure on Eden had steadily built up. 2 conferences to find a peaceful solution had come and gone.
There was nothing but Suez, 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 morning, noon and night in number 10. We would go to Chequers, I suppose, for the weekend, but then Chequers is just an office in the country, so that's no rest at all. I think we once went to a play. I don't remember any relaxation otherwise.
The stress affected Eden. His health had been fragile ever since a botched gallbladder operation 3 years earlier.
I woke with pain just after 3:30 and took some pethidine. I never got back to sleep again.
I could see how many pill bottles there were. And so at that period, I don't think that he was taking anything he hadn't always been taking since his first operation.
Nasser, by contrast, felt considerably less stress.
The strange thing was that following the takeover of the canal and the threats which were made, his certainty about an attack began to decrease. The more time passed, the more he would say that no attack was going to happen.
At the annual party conference, Eden made it clear that he did not rule out the use of force.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, when Colonel Nasser seized the canal, we thought it our duty to take certain military steps in the eastern Mediterranean. The government has no intention of modifying or withdrawing from this decision.
But he was now running out of time. At some point soon, he was going to have to decide what to do with the large force he was assembling.
The operation either had to be stopped and disbanded, in which case the whole crisis would be over in a sense, but with a total triumph for Nasser, or else it had to go forward.
But to go forward, Eden needed a pretext, and that was lacking.
Here he was with this personal declaration of war against Nasser, but no means of putting it into effect, because although Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal Company, he hadn't given us any casus belli. He hadn't actually stopped a ship or arrested a British subject or shot anybody or done anything which would give us the opportunity to go in and invade. And this was frustrating Eden enormously.
The day after the party conference, an unexpected meeting at Chequers was to give Eden the pretext he wanted. This was decisive. The French had sent General Maurice Charles, their deputy chief of staff, to see Eden.
Shah unveiled this plan, which was a total surprise to us at the time.
What would be the reaction of Great Britain if Israel were to attack Egypt?
Well, that's a very difficult question. There's no need to take notes, Guy.
Guy Millard closed his notebook, but he remembers what followed.
We were aware that the French were in very close contact with the Israelis because they'd been supplying with aircraft and with training for their pilots on these aircraft and so on. We were not aware that their relations had gone so far that they'd actually been negotiating this kind of thing with the Israelis. So it was a total surprise.
I have a plan of action, Sir Anthony, for Britain and France to gain control of the Suez Canal. Supposing Israel should be invited to attack Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula, then France and Britain would order both sides to withdraw their forces from the Suez Canal, permitting an Anglo-French force to intervene. We occupy the canal on the pretext that we save it from damage by fighting, while actually seizing control of the entire waterway and all its ports.
Well, of course, I shall give these suggestions very careful consideration and convey my reactions to your government in a couple of days.
It was as if suddenly the heavens had opened, and here was the opportunity at last.
The French leaders were hugely relieved to hear Eden confirm that he accepted the Schall plan when he visited them.
Alors Schall a eu un grand mérite, c'est de convaincre.
Schall deserves credit for convincing Eden, to our surprise, as we thought he would cave in under American pressure.
Et à notre étonnement, parce qu'on pensait à la fin que Eden, devant la pression.
And I can tell you frankly that without the English, we would not have gone in.
Et je dois dire très franchement que sans les Anglais, nous n'aurions pas.
We were astonished when Eden said, "Yes, I want to take part."
À notre étonnement, Eden a dit mais si, moi je veux en faire partie.
Eden was well aware that this must all be kept secret.
I remember him discussing with me what would happen if we informed the Americans of our talks with the French. And I said, well, quite obviously, they will oppose what is being suggested, and they will do their utmost to prevent us doing it.
The French now took the initiative. They persuaded their two allies, Britain and Israel, to sit down together with them and plan a war. The location they chose was a villa hidden away in the Paris suburb of Sèvres. Ben-Gurion and his most trusted advisors managed to leave secretly for France.
On our way to the airport, in the car there were the three of us, Ben-Gurion, Diane and myself. Diane put on a pair of glasses, and Ben-Gurion put on a hat of his head, which was so famous with, you know, the flowing white hair. And I was squeezed in the middle between the two of them.
The omens were not good. Ben-Gurion had very mixed memories from the time when the British ruled Palestine.
Ben-Gurion, at that time, didn't trust Great Britain. Eden was a little bit of an exception, being close to Churchill, but Ben-Gurion wasn't convinced that he's a man that can make decisions.
Eden sent his foreign secretary, Selwyn Lloyd, a man not always at ease with foreigners.
Nothing was to be known about this whole arrangement. And we were picked up there and taken to a villa at Sèvres which was the center of the resistance during the war.
The Israelis had already arrived after a grueling 17-hour flight. Ben-Gurion looked ill, and another member of the delegation was asleep. When Selwyn Lloyd arrived, he was not impressed by what he found, and it showed.
Cold like ice. He wasn't a very charismatic, smiling gentleman, so it was a dry martini full of ice coming in and meeting a highly suspicious group of people.
Too aloof, too estranged. That's the way we saw him.
He tried to avoid us as much as he could. We didn't go into small talks like with the French.
The representatives sat arguing around the dining table from tea time till midnight. Ben-Gurion wanted the British and the French to attack the Egyptian airfields earlier. He was frightened that if the time gap between the Israeli invasion and the Anglo-French intervention was too long, the newly equipped Egyptian Air Force would flatten Tel Aviv.
Ben-Gurion stayed during the Blitz in 1940-41 in London and had a strong trauma from that period. And he was afraid that something like that might happen to Tel Aviv.
Ben-Gurion put considerable pressure on Selwyn to agree to advance the attack on the airfields by 72 hours. And at midnight, Selwyn could only say that he couldn't agree to that, and he would have to return to London.
The conference was now at breaking point.
He knocked with his fist on the table. And that was that. He was ready to quit because, a priori, he wasn't totally convinced.
Très tendu. On a pensé d'ailleurs que
Very tense.
finalement tout cela allait se
We thought finally that all this would lead to failure.
par un échec généralisé.
Perez was desperate to stop Ben-Gurion leaving, so he arranged for their plane to have a mechanical fault.
Well, I told Ben-Gurion, you don't have a plane to fly back, so forget it.
The younger members of the Israeli delegation felt they needed cheering up, so they drove to this nightclub.
We were young guys. We wanted to see a famous French nightclub.
Beautiful one, very gallant. We were sitting in the lodge, watching it a little bit. I went down, I spoke with some of the girls.
But Perez and Diane were worried sick about the negotiations.
Sitting and watching the nightclub, our heart was somewhere else, as you can imagine. We were preoccupied all the time with it. And finally we lost our patience and went back to the hotel.
And I was very angry. I was a young man. I wanted to stay there, but of course I couldn't.
Following day, with the talks in abeyance, the French foreign minister flew to London to try and find a compromise.
Ce qui l'avait frappé, c'était le côté solennel.
What struck him initially was the solemn and cold nature of the meeting. He got the impression that he was in front of a sort of jury who were interrogating him. There were several cabinet ministers surrounding Eden. He came away feeling that he had finally convinced Eden, but he felt there was still some hesitancy.
In fact, Eden's only condition was that Israel must make an attack which clearly threatened the canal. The next morning, he sent a new man, Patrick Dean, the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, back to France with instructions to sort this out. Dean put this point to General Diane when he and Logan arrived in the afternoon.
Diane picked out of his pocket a packet of cigarettes, which was almost empty, and scribbled on the packet a sketch map of the canal and indicated that the main thrust of the Israeli attack, when it was launched, would be westward. I pressed him again, what is going to be a serious attack on the canal with that scenario?
The Israeli target marked on Diane's sketch, though vague, seemed close enough to the canal to be a threat, so meeting Eden's crucial precondition. But the French and the Israelis wanted to get the British agreement in writing.
About now, we heard a typewriter being used in a neighbouring room. We hadn't anticipated that there would be a record, it hadn't been mentioned.
The French and the Israelis made it clear they expected Dean to sign. After conferring with Logan, he did.
After the signature, the British just left immediately. There were no shake hands or something like that, just goodbye, goodbye, and they left. But the French and the Israelis remained in Sevres, and they opened up bottles of champagne. There was a very strong mood of fraternity by then.
In the meantime, Logan and Dean had returned secretly to London.
We were driven to number 10, where Pat Dean presented this document to Eden, who immediately said, "Oh my God, I never thought it would be written down."
The next day, Eden sent Dean and Logan to Paris to do what they could to persuade Pinault to destroy the document.
J'étais aggravé par le fait que
we were a little aggrieved that Eden had made it known through Dean that he wanted to burn the freshly signed agreement, so as to leave no trace.
qui venait d'être signé pour qu'il n'y ait pas de traces.
We had been conducted into the grand staterooms at the Quai d'Orsay. There we were left from about 11 o'clock until late afternoon. Of necessity, Pat Dean went to open the door and sample the corridor, but found the door locked. And there we remained until about tea time, when we were taken in to Pinault, who said the French government could not agree with the request.
On the same day as Dean and Logan were trying to destroy the incriminating document, Eden was boasting about its contents to his chief whip, Ted Heath.
Ted.
Good morning, Prime Minister.
We've got an agreement. Israel has agreed to invade Egypt. We shall then send in our own forces, backed up by the French, of course, to separate the contestants and to regain the canal. No need to involve our American friends. Ted, you must realize, this is the highest form of statesmanship.
Right. Yes, Prime Minister.
But Eden was less confident than he appeared. There were waverers in the cabinet, and in some ways he was quite isolated. So he took a step which suggested he needed to boost his authority.
Eden sent for me. He was very friendly, exhilarated, the way the old Eden one remembered him.
Anthony Montague Brown was private secretary to Sir Winston Churchill.
Eden said, if I were to offer Winston a seat in the cabinet without portfolio, would he accept? And I was astounded. I couldn't imagine anything less likely. I said, I don't think he'd like responsibility without power.
Montague Brown duly reported back to Churchill.
He listened without comment. I went through things, the timing and so on. And I came to that bit. And then a broad smile spread over his face. I must say, you do take a lot on yourself. You refuse me a seat in the cabinet without even asking me. And so I said, but you mean you wanted one? No, I don't want one.
The day before the planned Israeli attack was due to begin, General Dayan launched an audacious, secret, preemptive strike from this airfield. He hoped it would paralyze the Egyptians before the war even started.
The mission I was briefed on was to shoot down the Egyptian High Command aircraft, an Ilyushin 14, that was due to fly from Damascus to Cairo.
A well-placed Israeli spy in Damascus was sure General Abdel Hakim Amr, the Egyptian supreme commander, would be aboard. The moment Amr's plane left Damascus, the information was relayed back to the control tower at Ramat David. Chateau prepared to take off at dusk. By the time he found the Egyptian plane, it was pitch dark.
So I went to fly wing in wing. It was flying like this and I was flying like this.
From there, he could look into the plane unobserved and see Egyptian staff officers. But when he dropped back and fired, he had to fly so slowly that his Meteor went into a spin.
It exploded. Now you have a ball of fire spinning and a dark aircraft spinning, and it's hypnotic. You've seen the flames underneath you, above you, and so on, but it's for a fraction of a second. And then you're out.
Many top officers perished, but Amr did not. At the very last minute, he'd switched to a later plane. But General Dayan was still very pleased, as Chateau discovered when he landed.
Dayan was there, waiting. So he poured some cognac and said, well, shooting down at general headquarters is half the war. Let's drink to the other half.
Nasser never found out what happened to his plane. The story was kept secret for decades. In Cyprus, at that time a British colony, a massive build-up of British and French forces was nearing its conclusion, ready for the day when the secret plan was put into action. George Black was one of the pilots.
By the time we got to Cyprus, the airfield at Akrotiri was very, very busy indeed, and not just with Royal Air Force aircraft, but of course we had the French aircraft there as well.
Just hours before the planned Israeli attack on Egypt, 18 French fighter bombers were flown to Cyprus. The joint Anglo-French Air Force commander, Air Vice Marshal Dennis Barnett, assumed the aircraft were part of the Allied build-up on the island.
I went down to the beach to look for Air Marshal Barnett. He was sitting on a rock. I said to Barnett, we have a squadron which is going to land at Akrotiri and then fly on to Israel. He went very pale and said,
yes, I see.
He was surprised, very surprised. It hadn't occurred to him that collusion with the Israelis could be possible. So he now discovered that alongside the Anglo-French operation, we had a separate covert operation with the Israelis.
Even the squadron leader of the newly arrived French planes, Marcel Jouillot, was left in the dark about their next destination.
We took off from Akrotiri, having been given an envelope to open only once we were airborne. But it was dark when I opened it, and I couldn't see a thing. Finally, I vaguely saw through the light of the instruments the word Israel.
There were quite a few surprises in store for Jouillot when he landed. First, the Israelis immediately replaced the French markings on his plane with Israeli ones. Then he was photographed and given an Israeli ID card.
If we were captured and imprisoned, we simply had to say,
I'm Israeli.
Sending the planes was part of a secret agreement between the French and the Israelis, designed to protect Israel from Nasser's Soviet bombers. The conspiracy plan finally went into action late in the afternoon on October the 29th, with an Israeli parachute drop in Egypt. Only 395 paratroopers took part, landing in the Sinai Desert 20 miles from Suez, hardly the major threat to the canal which Diane had promised. But it was to be enough for Eden and the French. Nasser was mystified when the parachute landing was reported to him. He rang one of his closest associates, Mohammed Hakel.
ايه هيك في حاجة غريبة بتحصل. الإسرائيليين في سيناء عمالين يحتلوا موقع خالي ورا التاني زي ما يكونوا بيحاربوا الرمل. طيب تعالى لي أنا عاوزك. تعال.
News of the Israeli attack reached the British ambassador to the UN, Sir Pearson Dixon, while he was at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Douglas Hurd, the ambassador's private secretary, was the messenger.
When this news came through, it happened to be the first night of the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Very grand occasion. Callas was singing Enorma. I remember this very vividly.
Sir Pearson Dixon knew nothing about Britain's collusion with Israel.
I took the message in to Sir Pearson Dixon, and this one simply said, don't call a meeting of the Security Council. Don't go along with that. This was all we had.
Dixon, known as Bob, usually worked very closely with his American colleague, Henry Cabot Lodge, during a Middle East crisis.
Cabot Lodge appeared in one of the intervals of the opera, and to see Bob, his old friend, etc., and was very puzzled when all that Bob Dixon could say was, "I'm sorry, Cabot, but my only instructions are, not at this stage, at any rate, to call a meeting of the Security Council." So it got off onto a start of a sort of embarrassment, we not knowing what was going on, only having a negative piece of instruction, and the Americans very baffled and upset and uncertain as to what the hell was going on.
Eisenhower's reaction was to write to Eden the following morning.
Dear Anthony, last evening our ambassador to the United Nations met with your ambassador to the United Nations, Pearson Dixon, to request him to join us in presenting the case to the United Nations this morning. We were astonished to find that he was completely unsympathetic, stating frankly that his government would not agree to any action whatsoever to be taken against Israel. All of this development, including the possible involvement of you and the French in a general Arab war, seems to me to leave your government and ours in a very sad state of confusion.
Eden was now approaching the point of no return.
I took him these telegrams and I handed them to him, and he was sitting in bed, you see, propped up by pillows, but ready dressed with a tie and collar and everything, just had to slip on his coat and his trousers to go across to the House of Commons. And he did at one point said to me as he was reading this, because I stood waiting, he said, "You personally do agree that what I'm doing is necessary, don't you?" Well, you see, the Prime Minister oughtn't to ask people like me.
This was the day when Eden told first the Queen and then the Commons about the steps which would take Britain to war. The Egyptian and Israeli ambassadors were summoned and told to withdraw 10 miles on either side of the canal or face Anglo-French military intervention. One side awaited its ultimatum with impatience.
I was sitting here in the Minister of Defense, waiting for the ultimatum. He didn't arrive. And so I called up the French ambassador and asked him, "Sir, do you have any ultimatum for us?" He says, no, I'm going to check. Then I called in the British ambassador. He says, maybe you have an ultimatum. Neither of them had.
Except for one or two people, nobody in the British or French foreign offices knew anything about the conspiracy. Nasser rejected the ultimatum, thus giving Eden and the French the excuse they needed to invade.
I haven't thought at all that Britain would would begin any attack against us, because it was clear that any attack against us would affect the British position all over the Arab countries and would mean the end of the British relations and influence in the Middle East. So we were waiting for Israeli attack. We were thinking about French collusion with Israel. We were keeping completely out of mind the British collusion.
Meanwhile, at the UN, the American ambassador proposed a resolution in the Security Council calling on the Israelis to withdraw.
Will those who are in favor of its adoption please raise their hands?
And on all member states to refrain from the use of force.
It was almost inconceivable that Britain and France should cast vetoes in view of their whole record in the UN and the position that they had there. And therefore there was a sense of actual amazement at the physical moment when Bob Dixon, raised his hand to veto the resolution passing.
Abstention? Abstentions.
After the arrival of reinforcements, the paratroopers who'd opened the Israeli attack 2 days earlier were on the move again. Lieutenant Colonel Ariel Sharon, their up-and-coming commander, had ordered his men to occupy the Mitla Pass, which lay between them and the Suez Canal. But there was no proper recce, and his men drove into a trap. Egyptians were firing from well-protected caves and crevices on either side of the pass.
We were driving along the road, getting an almighty barrage from both sides. The Egyptians were holding positions between 20 and 100 meters from the road, along a kilometer stretch of the pass.
Sharon wanted his ambushed men rescued, and another unit was sent up and over a ridge above the pass to try and reach them.
In this area, there was no place to hide. So the company commander told me, if they want me to charge, I will, and he almost cried.
Despite the danger, they were ordered to charge.
When we charged, heavy fire was shot against us. He was my company commander. He ran nearby myself. He got a bullet in his chest. I got a bullet in my helmet.
Lieutenant Dan Zeev saw it all happen from below.
Our people thought that the Egyptians were near the road. They didn't realize that they were also in the crevices further up, until they were shot from behind as they charged past.
We were 21. Almost half of them were killed or wounded. We suffered quite a number of casualties. all in vain. Nothing good came out of it.
38 Israelis were killed during the battle for the Mittler Pass, dying in an operation which was supposed to be a token battle for the benefit of Eden and the French. In the evening, the paratroopers moved along the contours of the pass, killing the Egyptians in the caves and crevices. 150 Egyptians died. The rest fled. A last-minute delay to the start of the bombing of Egypt almost disrupted the Anglo-French alliance with Israel. The postponement of the bombing by about 12 hours was a breach of the secret agreement. And it awoke Ben-Gurion's fears that the Egyptians might obliterate Tel Aviv with their new Soviet bombers. Diane sent Mordecai Bar-On to inform Ben-Gurion.
I've never seen Ben-Gurion so angry. All his fears came true now. All his suspicions, all his disbelief with the British came to fear. He said something in Hebrew, which I never heard him saying such things. He said something that amounts to, oh, this wretched old whore, meaning the British. That's about the sense that they exclaimed. And said immediately, call Dayan, tell him to bring back the paratroopers.
Once the RAF bombing started, no more was heard of Ben-Gurion's order. When the planes reached Cairo, Nasser, who'd been entertaining the Indonesian ambassador at home, went outside.
I listened, and there was the jet aeroplanes. And I said to the Indonesian ambassador that these are jet aeroplanes, and the Israelis don't have jet aeroplanes. These are British. I went over to the roof of the house. I saw the bombardment of the international airport. I went direct to the army headquarters.
It was clear from the start that the RAF was trying to destroy Nasser's new air force. The first raid sent one of Nasser's closest associates, Major Salah Salem, into a panic.
Salah Salem كان عصبي.
Salah Salem was the nervous type. He was always nervous. He always thought with his nerves, not with his brain.
مش بدماغه. كان قال للرئيس إيه؟
So what did he say to the boss? He said, let's go and give ourselves up to the British embassy. We can't resist such force.
السفارة البريطانية. لأن إحنا ما نقدرش.
But the boss said to Salah, don't worry, we will resist, and we will be victorious.
فارس قال له صلاح هدي نفسك. نحن سنقاوم وسننتصر.
كان واقف الدكتور أحمد ثروت.
Ahmad Thawat, the president's doctor, was also there, and the president said, Ahmad, please give Salah an injection to calm him down.
If Nasser had accepted Salem's advice and gone round to the embassy, he would have found the staff there busily weeding out incriminating documents.
Well, there were so many documents there dated from way, way back which had not been weeded. And so therefore we had to have a chain of our chaps passing the files out to toss onto the braziers. And I remember with some feeling of joy throwing on the file British Middle East policy onto the brazier.
For Eisenhower, first the Israeli attack and then the British bombing less than a week before polling day could not have come at a worse time. He felt badly let down.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. As it is the manifest right of any of these nations to take such decisions and actions, it is likewise our right, if our judgment so dictates, to dissent. We believe these actions to have been taken in error, for we do not accept the use of force as a wise or proper instrument for the settlement of international disputes.
we were watching it on TV, and we kind of smiled because we knew darn well that he knew all the time what was happening. And this was kind of a show on his part, I think. But it was also to conceal the fact that we had used the U-2s to obtain the information.
The following day, the British bombing continued in earnest.
Once we got closer, there was just lines and lines of MiG-15s, all beautifully spaced outside the hangars. I mean, if you run down a line of aircraft and you just keep the trigger pressed the whole time and the gun sight on target, you're going to destroy a lot of aircraft or damage them anyway. I would think there was the best part of 50, 60 MiGs on the ground. There was no attempt to put them onto shelters or leave them in the hangars or even disperse them on the airfield. It was unbelievable, really. I just couldn't believe that the aircraft were lined up.
Nasser publicly exuded confidence, but he had moments of doubt. A popular song of the time, "We have entrusted Egypt into your hands," strongly affected him. He told a friend, "I've been questioning myself. Have I behaved well towards this trust or not?" On Eden, the pressure was now even greater. The bombing and the knowledge that an invasion fleet was on its way to Port Said had aroused the Labour opposition. But a potentially wounding blow came at the end of a tumultuous debate from his own side. William Yates, a Tory well disposed towards Nasser, had discovered Eden's conspiracy with France and Israel.
I had been to France, and I had come to the conclusion that Her Majesty's government was involved in an international conspiracy. It was chaotic what happened. The Labour members yelled, waved all the papers, stood on the benches, and it was really a most extraordinary sight.
Everyone screaming and shouting. I mean, it was a bear pit, you know. It was very calm all through Suez. I mean, like people are in a great crisis, you become calm, don't you?
But Yates's inability to spell out the details of the conspiracy saved Eden acute embarrassment. But he did repeat his accusation to Eden in the lobby afterwards.
To which he looked very, very pale, and very, very pale, and perspiring, and he said 2 words, perfide Albion, which means, of course, treacherous Britain. I never was able to make out whether that was a way of passing me off as of no consequence, or what was the object of using that expression, perfide Albion.
In the meantime, an Anglo-French flotilla was moving steadily towards the Egyptian coast. The fates of both Nasser and Eden hung in the balance.
Next week, in the last episode of the series, the Suez crisis reaches an explosive climax as French and British troops invade Egypt to seize the canal with disastrous political consequences. And Radio 4 reveals new evidence on the role of MI6 during the Suez crisis, Saturday night at 8.